And it's time for our second panel, Empowering Tomorrow, Clean Hydrogen, Energy Justice, and Community Transformation. We have as our moderator, Dana Harmon, and John Hall, Sergio Castellanos, and Liz Dalton here. So we'll just kick it off with you all.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Hope you all had a lovely lunch, and thank you all so much for being here. Our panel this afternoon now is Empowering Tomorrow, Clean Hydrogen, Energy Justice, and Community Transformation. As Dave said, my name is Dana Harmon, and I have the pleasure of serving as an Energy Transition Fellow here with the Energy Institute at UT. I'm also on a small consulting firm here in town, in which capacity I've actually had the pleasure of working with most of the folks on this stage on issues ranging from energy poverty and energy insecurity to climate equity and an equitable energy transition. So now let me please introduce our esteemed panelist, John Hall, who is the president and CEO of the Houston Advanced Research Center, Liz Ramsay Dalton, who's co-founder and partner of Mission Strategies, and Dr. Sergio Castellanos, who's assistant professor of civil, architectural, and environmental engineering here at UT Austin. Welcome to you all. You can read more about their bios on the conference website, but let's dive right into the panel discussion. So we find ourselves at a really interesting and unique moment in history. There are lots of us, myself included, that feel that this is an opportunity to not only drive an equitable energy transition, but also drive systemic economic growth. And hydrogen has a key role to play in that energy system. We've got the Inflation Reduction Act, we have Justice 40, IIJA, and we'll talk a bit about each of those and the opportunities provided in this discussion today. And we have a very strong foundation set by energy justice leaders and organizers over the past several decades. But this opportunity is also met with some fundamental tensions that we'll talk about today. We've got momentum, but without some focused, intentional, explicit collaboration with communities, hydrogen investments may not address some of the disparities in our energy systems in times past. With this transition, we've got the opportunity to set the foundation to get it right, and that's what we'll talk about today. We'll give each of our panelists about 5 minutes to share opening remarks from their perspective on these topics, and then we'll go into some moderated questions and answers, and we'll save some time for the audience. So, Liz, why don't we kick it off with you?
Perfect. Thanks, Dana, and thanks everybody for being on this really important panel. Brian and the Energy Institute. Truly, when you're building a day about the future of hydrogen in Texas, I think it's really important that we have this critical conversation about what the path forward looks like as we build this clean hydrogen economy in our state and beyond. So for those who are just joining after lunch, the first half of the day was talking about just the incredible opportunity that this transition to clean hydrogen represents for our economy, but also for Texas citizens and beyond. We're talking something like hundreds of billions of dollars of investment when you look at clean hydrogen and associated CCUS projects. We're talking 200,000 plus high-paying jobs that are, will be available to the state and our citizens. And when you think about what this transition looks like, it's a huge opportunity for us to do this differently than maybe some of our industrial and energy policies have been set, historically in the world and certainly in this country. A lot of the conversation that we're having around centering community engagement and justice and equity is really being driven by the federal government at this juncture. So the Obama administration, which I served in, the Biden-Harris administration in its first week in office signed an executive order called the Justice 40 Initiative. And with that, they dedicated or mandated that at least 40% of all benefits for certain federal programs must benefit disadvantaged communities. And we'll talk a little bit more about those definitions and what goes into that. But it's really a historic and unprecedented change in the way that federal funding opportunities are presented to applicants, and in this case, certainly the hydrogen ecosystem that we're building in the state. Through those programs, and in this case, I'm talking about the U.S. Department of Energy, every applicant has to center their engagement and their strategy around the communities that they are impacting. And so we've talked a little bit about the clean hydrogen hubs this morning, and certainly the focus of today's session. But that means that folks that are not taking that seriously won't be selected for the funding opportunity. They are weighting the community benefits aspect of this equally with the technical credibility, with the financial sustainability. And so it's on a playing field that typically through technical programs we just haven't seen before. On the tax side, we've talked about the Inflation Reduction Act a little bit this morning, the tax credits that are being driven for hydrogen production development, so 45V and 45Q, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, in the next policy session, also have what we call these bonus credits, and that's driven around what is a company or a private sector investment's commitment to prevailing wage and investing in apprenticeship programs and workforce development opportunities. And again, when you combine these federal programs, funding programs with tax incentives, and then you're capitalizing so much private investment, it's just a way that we can move an entire economy forward. But the question is, how do we do that in a way that benefits all? Everybody in this room values clean air. Everybody in this room values high-paying, reliable jobs. Everybody here wants reliable, affordable, clean energy. Clean hydrogen represents an entire opportunity for us to get this right, to do better, and to do that in a more productive way moving forward, and in a way that doesn't just benefit a few, but it benefits all. And so as we're going into the conversation, throughout this panel and throughout the rest of the day, it's centering that, and how do you make sure that as we're bringing folks to the table and having that conversation, it's not one-sided, and we have the ability to rise an entire economy as we move forward with that. So maybe I'll pause there and pass it back.
Thank you, Liz. That was a fantastic setup. And one of the things that we've been talking about related to the federal funding and the tax credits is how do we also think about this in a way that may be sustainable and outlive perhaps some of the Justice 40 programs or the federal funding, but really is sustainable into the future. So thank you for that perspective. John.
Thank you. Let me begin by saying this. For those of you who are still working on your college degree, I am envious of you. Under the best case scenario, I have 6 years to work, and you have your whole life ahead of you to what I think will be perhaps one of the most exciting times that we have witnessed in terms of how energy is produced and used and transported, and how it is used to also uplift segments of our society that, frankly, the current energy system has not. I'll share this for a factoid with you, and for contextual purposes. Oil was discovered at Spindletop in Texas in 1903. That same year, the Texas legislature enacted statutes that prohibited African Americans from voting, and subsequently extended that to the Latino community. There is a direct relationship between economic opportunity and political power. And because that was absent for a long period of time as energy developed, as the fossil fuel industry developed and took off in this state, disadvantaged and low-income communities, many of which are inhabited largely by minority residents, were left out of receiving the benefits of energy, and were instead were relegated to a position of having to deal with all of those externalities of energy, including in neighborhoods adjacent to those areas, being burdened with high levels of emissions that cause cancer and lung disease and all of those things. And the fact that as we enter this new revolution of figuring out how we make, use, and produce energy, we're having real conversations, and there's a focus on developing strategies to make sure that this transition is both equitable and inclusive. That is encouraging. That in and of itself is very significant. On the other hand, we can't be satisfied with that, because it is that we're going to face some real challenges in order to achieve the outcomes of Justice 40 that Liz articulated. In many of these communities where we're hoping that these benefits flow, the social infrastructure to ensure that 40% of the benefits flow to disadvantaged residents is not in place. It's got to be built. And then there is another issue that I'm concerned about. Justice 40 is an executive order put in place by President Biden. It could also be taken away by another president in 15 months from now. And so the big question we face is, how do we take advantage of the opportunities of Justice 40 now, but recognizing that the most investments that will be made in the energy transition for hydrogen and for wind and solar or what have you is going to be made over the next 15 to 20 years. And the question is, now that major energy companies are being challenged to achieve the goals of Justice 40 as they seek funding both in terms of tax credits and grants, is there an opportunity to institutionalize this in the energy sector so that this is not just a 3-year or 5-year effort, but it's something that can be sustained? And if it can be sustained for the next 15 to 20 years, then we're talking about an energy transition, including how we make hydrogen and utilize it, can be transformative in the most disadvantaged and the most impoverished communities of the state. I'll stop there.
Thank you, John.
Hey, thank you, and thank you to the organizers. I've been thinking about the role of universities, minority-serving institutions, HBCUs, and what does it mean for them to play a role in this hydrogen ecosystem? And I think it starts all by the motivation that it's climate change that's happening, right? And I think it's a complex issue, but at the same time, because of that complexity, there's a call to have diverse backgrounds. And so there's a clear tie-in between having diverse backgrounds in the conversation to begin with, and that can be reflected in the type of universities that are playing a role. Similarly, students that are playing a role as well. And so to address this type of issues that are quite complex, and having this diverse background, there has to be funding for that to happen. There has to be some incentive for innovation, and there has to be a focus on creating workforce of the future, right? So funding-wise, there's always, of course, the need to get more funding to develop the next thing, but there's also, not all funding is equally distributed, right? So when we're thinking about the elite institutions versus more that are not so focused on research, actually we see that more than 80% of dollars go to, the R1 universities, or the ones that focus heavily on research. And when we control for dollars spent per student served, there's more than $300 spent in students that go to research-intensive universities versus minority-serving ones. And so I think when we're thinking about this diversity thing, we can look internally within our own ecosystem, but it's important that we recognize that there's more people that are not seated here today, students that are also eager to participate, and we can think about creating those links with them as well. So academic point of view is one, but it can extend into many different levels as well. In the innovation side of things, I think that's core to the efforts that academia or universities is trying to do. In this point, going back to, for example, community colleges. Here in Texas, we have plenty of them. If you look at the enrollment, it's about 70% of minorities enrollment, so it's mostly constituted basically by our people of color. And so it's important to recognize that as we broaden this conversation and we're trying to look for innovations, whether it's technical, social, they have to be part of the discussion as well, right? And so at the same time, it creates this feedback loop that it serves back their local economies as well. And so I think there's a direct benefit and incentive to do so. And then the last one is the workforce development. I think in this one, again, it's part of the core role of the academic institutions. And so I think it mimics a little bit of the efforts as before, the innovation, but the workforce is similarly, it requires good connections between the communities, because that's the ultimate people that we want to serve, but also who's being benefited from that educational system. And so within that, there's a driver to continue growing for that workforce. Now, there are challenges in the process, right? I think if we look just internally here and think about universities trying to do community-engaged approaches. So from that perspective, I think the incentives are still misaligned. We're driven to publish something in the lapse of 1 to 2 years, maybe 3, depending on the agency. But these things take time. And so there's some challenges embedded in the system. We need to think about how to or shift away from them, and how do we establish a clear connection in this path that we're trying to do for equitable energy transition? So making sure that even if they're not aligned at this point, how can we creatively think about making sure that this eventually tend to merge? And to John's point of view, I think it's exciting as well to see students here that will be the drivers of this in the future of this conversation. So important to have an understanding of what are the challenges right now, where we are, but also looking beyond a little bit of our internal ecosystem as well.
Thank you, Sergio. And thank you all for those comments. I think this is framing the conversation really well, because really each of you are kind of representing almost different components of this ecosystem that will be required to move through this energy transition, and to do so in a way that is inclusive and equitable. And we're talking a lot about really fundamentally different approaches that will be required in order to achieve the goal that we're trying to achieve. But Sergio, you were also bringing up the innovations required, and we have quite a legacy in this state, in Texas, in terms of energy innovation and leading the way both for the nation and globally in terms of what's possible. Would love to hear your thoughts on what do we need to be, how might we build upon some of the solid foundations that have been created to make sure that this transition's inclusive and equitable? So what are we doing well now that we need to hold on to and make sure that we bring forward with us? And where are the gaps, and where do we really need to focus?
I think for the energy companies have a history of reaching out and informing a broader community where their facilities are located, and has a history of investing in those communities. I visited a community meeting of a major energy company several months ago, and they had invited their community advisory council, about 40 people, and during the course of the conversation, each person sitting around the table was provided the opportunity to offer any comments that he or she may have had. And I observed, and everybody in the room talked about how wonderful this company was, and the benefits and the jobs and the investments that it was making, and how they were excited about the hydrogen opportunity, because that assured that those benefits and those opportunities that it had provided in that broader community would continue. I noticed that there were no persons of color in that room, and so I Googled for the population, the makeup of the population, and it was about 60% Latino and African American. So when it came time for me to talk to you, sometimes I just don't know how to act. So when it came time for me to talk, I said, I think it's wonderful that you're having these testimonials, but as I look around the room, 60% of the local population is not represented at the table. What would their message be if they were here? So I think what we're talking about when we start talking about community engagement and connecting communities to these benefits, particularly low-income and disadvantaged communities, the challenge for energy companies is doing what they have always done, but taking it to those communities so that those communities are aware of those opportunities, and then putting in place real strategies to deliver those opportunities and those benefits to those communities. I've done a lot of work in Beaumont, Port Arthur. That was an objective poll done probably about 5 years ago, and it showed, and the population in that region is very, very diverse, and it showed that there was a higher level of support for energy jobs in that region of the state than anywhere else in the country. But then when I talked to the community folks, and even the mayors and the elected officials of that area, they were frustrated and mad because they had given the energy companies tax exemptions, in order for the expansions that had occurred, or for the new facilities that had been created. And they said, we gave them these tax breaks, but we're not benefiting from the jobs. So one of the challenges is to embrace what we have done in the past and figure out what we have to do differently to ensure that the billions, if not the trillions of dollars that are going to be invested in this energy transition, including for hydrogen, are extended to those communities that have been left out. I think community engagement is key. I think building institutional mechanisms whereby the folks who live next to the refinery that's going to make the hydrogen or use it, those folks get invited in to be part of the conversation before the permits are issued from the federal government for the facilities to be built. And as they're talking about the benefits that will be provided, and that they get to, instead of just being notified of what's coming, they get to be part of a conversation and a dialogue about how these significant benefits can be realized in their respective communities. It's amazing what happens when you just start talking to people and you give everybody the same information. Our failure in the past has been we didn't do that with energy in particular. And we have an opportunity to do it now with hydrogen and other forms of clean energy. And it would be a catastrophic mistake if we don't do that.
Well, maybe I'll just double down on what Mr. Hall just said, and through that lens.
So I told you I only had 6 years left to go, and so Liz referred to me as Mr. Hall, so she recognized that too, right?
20 more, right? At least 20 more. There isn't a company out there, a Fortune 500 company, not just energy, but any company that doesn't have in their mission statement or their vision statement or their CSR report and filings that diversity, equity, inclusion, now more so justice aren't, a hallmark of what they are going to build in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And so I think one of the things that, we're doing well, that's a huge change than where we were 5 or 10 years ago. You have CEOs of major companies making these major commitments. But where, echoing your points here, where it starts to break down occasionally is when you are on the ground with frontline communities and having these conversations. And at least in the work that I do with clean energy companies across a number of different technologies in different parts of the country, is that you feel when you walk into a room that you have to defend what you've done. And I'll think back to a quote that Shalonda Baker, who runs the economic and justice work for the U.S. Department of Energy, said at Justice Week last week. And she said, look, we're trying to overcome 400 years of inequity and injustice in this country, and especially through energy systems. So I just say to these companies, you are not solely responsible for that. Your company is not solely responsible for that. And you yourself are not going to solve that. And your company's not going to solve that. So if you can take the defensive mechanism down when you're walking into some of these conversations and truly listen and hear what the needs are, what the resources that these folks want and what they want access to and what keeps them up at night, that's a very different conversation than you walking into a room and saying, oh, but we invested $5 million in this last year and here are the checklist of things that we did. We got it, and that's phenomenal. That's great work that you're doing. But there is an opportunity to do it differently. There is an opportunity to do it better. And the more that you can hear, listen, and react, you start to build trust, and that creates progress. When we have progress, we build more trust, and we just have an opportunity to do it better and differently than we did. It's not necessarily it doesn't have to be a hostile interaction. It's a difficult interaction. It's a challenging interaction. It's an uncomfortable interaction. But through this continued dialogue where you actually have a two-way conversation, I think we're going to be in a lot better spot.
Yeah, I think one of the things that have been done, not precisely in a good way or with a good outcome, like a weak example is, for example, Chapter 313 here in Texas, which is a tax property relief, essentially, to lure companies. And so that's focused solely on the jobs piece of things. There are deals that are being made. I think some of the issues are that they're done, but it leaves a lot of room for loopholes to happen. And so, examples here, when we see that they commit to hire people from the local community, local school district, But then when it comes to, let's say, language barriers, if they don't speak the language, then they don't hire. And so they don't commit to doing ESL, English as a second language programs. And so on paper, they do commit to things, but when it comes to really, foot on the ground, then it's pretty limiting. Something that I really like from this administration is the community benefits plan. And so I think this is a major first effort to really quantify things and have some sense of direction and keeping track of things. For those of you who don't know, the CBP or Community Benefits Plan is portion of a grant when you're submitting either for research or for pilot projects, demonstrations, physical hardware construction, in which you have to address 4 things. It's community and labor engagement, the American workforce, the DEIA, and Justice 40. So each of them requires a timeline, it requires a budget, it requires a contact person, it requires to fully address how you're going to be, touching on different subjects. So for community and labor engagements, it's like engagement that is meaningful with local stakeholders. That's a big question. How do you quantify the meaningfulness of an engagement, right? So you can already start identifying some challenges in the process. For workforce, you have to demonstrate that you'll be creating high-quality jobs. Instances here locally in Austin, they come, they say they're going to hire a given target. They do, but guess what? 90% is for people that are coming from other states to relocate, high-paying jobs, and the remaining is for just entry-level jobs that don't have this potential to bring economic and social mobility, right? You have to have plans to attract, train, and retain skilled workers, commitments to go above the prevailing wage requirements. For DEIA, partnerships with MSI, Minority Serving Institutes, partnership with training organizations, so more hands-on skills as well, contracting women, minority-owned, and veteran-owned businesses. And for Justice 40, just identifying the disadvantaged communities, how are they going to be benefiting from this investment, right? You have to show that they will be getting those benefits. And so as you can see, it tries to address many different things, and I think that's a great first step, right? Because it hasn't been done before. Being on the inside with, speaking with colleagues, with companies, it does get people to think, how can we do this right? And I appreciate that, because I don't think that has happened before, at least in my limited experience. One of the challenges, and I'm sure there are many, is that it's, the good thing within that is that it's flexible, because you get to determine how you're going to address those challenges. The bad thing is that it's flexible, because then there's no standard. You might interpret that you're having some benefit here, but it might not be the case. And when it comes to reviewing these community benefits plans, I'll tell you, there are no community members in there. It's just academics and industry people. So I think the process is still flawed, but again, I appreciate the intention. I think it's going to the right direction. Asking also Chalanda Baker, how do you envision the 2.0 version of the CBP? They're, making this as they go, essentially. They're focused on getting this launched, and yeah, it's true, I can see the momentum, the inertia that they have to overcome. But then the last thing, and perhaps this doesn't apply for the hydrogen per se, but many other projects that are focusing on community engagement, they end up penalizing a project if it doesn't scale. And when we think about environmental injustices, sometimes they're very local. It's hard to come in and defend that this will benefit other many hundreds of communities to be awarded something, because that will perpetuate the cycle and these communities will be left off again, right? So I think flexibility in the way that things are defined and framed for making sure that those dollars are spent, it's an important thing as well. So things that are not working haven't worked, and the things that have the potential to work are in there.
Thank you. This time goes so quickly, and I want to make sure that we have plenty of time left for audience questions. So I'm just going to ask you one more of the prepared questions, and that is, because we have a room with full of students and researchers here who have the opportunity to shape this transition going forward, and I'm assuming quite from an interdisciplinary perspective, what are some of the key opportunities that you see for students to engage in this topic going forward?
Sure, I can start. This hydrogen economy, clean energy transition requires people, business models, people from McCombs, just to keep something concrete here. Engineering, you name it, material science, macro levels, integration, There's a lot of that, but it's also encouraging to see students also being more vocal about their need to have evidence that their work will impact communities. So that social dimension is becoming more evident, and I think, having that structured in classes, but also in research is important. The good thing, something that typically tends to put students in a position that they feel they cannot take part, is that maybe they're doing, the chemical balances between solutions, and they don't see how that will impact communities. But at the same time, when it comes to community-oriented research, there's a spectrum. Sometimes it's just the investigator that is driving the conversation or the research without having to interact with communities, because maybe that doesn't align with your research, or maybe that doesn't align with your personal traits. Then you can have more community influence, community engaged, and community driven. So there's a wide spectrum, just to say that, in which one can potentially start thinking about linking the type of things that you learn, that you're working on, to impacts in communities. And it doesn't need to be you going and knocking on doors. It can be if you want, but there's more than that. And so just a shameless plug for our lab, always interested in hearing from students, reset-lab.com, or just find me afterwards, and we'll be more than happy to talk with you about that.
And I will offer this. I think if you talk to energy executives, they will tell you that if we don't have something like hydrogen that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions and hopefully priority pollutants, that they see a loss of good paying energy jobs. Hydrogen and potentially geothermal are important because much of the infrastructure that's used in the oil and gas industry can be adapted to utilize, to produce and transport and use hydrogen. But let me make the case for hydrogen. Why? Let me back up. There's a role that you also can play if you're students. I was in college during the Vietnam War. That war came to an end because students engaged and pushed the establishment to do that. You have an opportunity to push forward an equity agenda for your fellow citizens. And in doing that, you help yourselves. And let me share with you why hydrogen is so important. Most of the emissions problem we have in Texas today, both in terms of industry and vehicles, most of the emissions comes from cars and trucks and buses and trains and 18-wheelers and delivery trucks. Many of those applications are not suitable to be electrified. It's hard to electrify an 18-wheeler that's going to go hundreds of miles. It's even hard to electrify some of the Amazon delivery trucks that are going hundreds and hundreds of miles during the course of a day. With clean hydrogen, it's a way to take those type vehicles and have them become zero emitting as well. Think about this. A lot of emissions in neighborhoods are not from factories that are nearby, but by school buses and transit buses and delivery trucks. You will be surprised to know that one of the highest sources, a region of Houston that has the highest emissions is the Galleria, one of the most prominent areas in the city of Houston, but it's because of all of the vehicles. And I think that if you commit yourself to making sure we do the things that have to be done to address climate change, and we do that with everybody in mind, your civic engagement is going to be necessary to make us old folks do what needs to be done so we can have a cleaner and healthier planet as we move forward.
Well, following the extremely young John Hall here, just a couple of things. Look, I think Mike started us out today saying, the overarching stats of the clean hydrogen opportunity, and on that far right side of the slide, it noted that 30 to 60% of the projects under development or under consideration in Texas right now are going to reside in disadvantaged communities. This is the challenge and the opportunity of your career. If you can embed your thought process and your approach to this throughout your career, we got a chance at getting this right moving forward. You're in the room, you're having the conversations, you're connecting with one another through these types of events, and that's hugely important. This thing that is the Energy Institute and this ability to break down between silos of universities is hugely important. You're not going to engineer yourself out of this. You're not going to spreadsheet yourself out of this. You're not going to invest out of this. You're not going to policy out of this. You have to take a holistic approach across any different lever that you can pull, and I encourage you to get to know your colleagues and do that. The last thing I'll leave you with is look who's in the room and look who's not in the room. You have an opportunity as a student, but you also have an opportunity for the rest of your career to be very cognizant of who you're sitting next to and who is not have a seat at that table, and make sure that you can reach into the communities and talk to those folks as well. We had a conversation or a question earlier about education. All of you are in a position that you can volunteer with K through 12 organizations and help them understand what their career paths could look like, and I encourage you to do that. So thank you very much for that.
Well said.
Take
Thank
some
you.
questions.
Yes, we've got a few minutes for questions.
With clean energy jobs displace, or the potential for it to displace other energy jobs, what kind of upskilling or retooling policies, grassroots movements, et cetera, have you seen that have actually worked and produced good results?
Start or jump in?
As Sergio was indicating, the Justice 40 policy requires that there be a workforce strategy included. And one of the things that's occurring is industry is identifying the quantity of jobs and the types of jobs that are going to be created. And then as part of the workforce strategy, universities and community colleges and community-based organizations are being brought to the table to formulate training programs, educational curricula for degrees of various sorts, so that our educational system, starting in the public schools through college, begin to put in place the types of programs that are necessary to train people, to educate people to take on these jobs. And very importantly, community-based organizations are being engaged to especially introduce those folks who don't go to college to entry-level jobs, so that perhaps they can get an entry-level job, and then perhaps, in order to increase their chances for greater incomes, actually go to a community college and get a certificate or an associate degree. We're putting together a different application right now for another pot of money that's provided under the Inflation Reduction Act, and we're spending about 20% of the potential application to put together the workforce strategy, so that the programs that are needed are actually developed in time, so that potential employees have an opportunity to equip themselves to take advantage of these jobs.
And I'll say, perhaps making a parallel, we conducted a study on offshore wind here in the Gulf, and that's similar in the sense that it's nascent. It's not been deployed thus far. But what was encouraging was hearing from communities and community-based organizations that they wanted to start, clean slate and with some positive attributes for the community. So they want to have project labor agreements. They wanted to have ensure that safety, which is a big issue for right now oil and gas workers, that was paramount and that was first and center essentially. And so they had a set of conditions that they were pushing forward. And I thought that was really good, because as we were rushing to get into this new technology, whereas it's offshore wind or hydrogen or the next thing that will come, in 5 to 10 years, I think it's important to have a sense of what are the conditions that need to be enforced early on.
Last thing, labor is going to play a huge role in this transition. So the Texas Climate Jobs Project, as an example, is a strong voice for the role of labor in this transition, what it means to bring those resources to bear and how they can have access to all types of jobs. So there are many examples that we could give you where I think that's gone very well.
Thank you. Dave, do we have
Other
time for one
questions?
more?
Well, with that,
Okay, with that,
For
please,
time.
thank you very much for the conversation. Thank you to our panelists for the discussion, and thank you for your time.
Thanks, everyone.